real-world learning through inquiry-based learning. And it's a topic that I really, really want to know much more about. So I'm here with Michelle. Hi, Michelle. How are you?
Hi, Melissa. I'm very well, thank you. I've had a nice day, and I just wanted to say that I really admire everyone who's been to 6 sessions already, and some of you have probably had a long teaching day as well on top of that. So well done for that. And I really hope that you're not going to fall asleep during this session, because we're going to start with a really calm activity. So after such a long day of webinars, let's try and stay awake for a little bit longer.
We will, because we're in the hands of a really experienced presenter today. So Michelle, you're based in Spain, that's right, isn't it? But you're from the UK. And Michelle is actually a writer of mainstream and primary materials for ELT. She's worked with lots of international publishers, and I mean, this is her special interest area at the moment: inquiry-based learning, any learner-centered approaches. And I know she's worked with students from primary to secondary, so she's got lots and lots of ideas for us. So Michelle, when you're ready, I'll hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Melissa. So today I'm going to talk about the importance of making sure that our lessons are connected to the real world. And I'm going to show you how you can do this with an inquiry-based approach. Now, in my pre-webinar video that some of you may have seen, I asked you to think about the topics that your students are interested in. So I'd like you to keep these topics in your mind throughout the webinar, and think about how you might include these topics in your syllabus. But first, we're going to start with an activity, and we're going to do a guided visualization, which is one of my favorite activities to foster inspiration. So first of all, I want you to make sure that you're sitting comfortably, and you're going to try to relax. I'm sure that's not too difficult after a long day. So try to relax your neck and your shoulders and your arms and your legs. And you can let your hands fall and rest on your lap or on your desk. And if you're comfortable doing so, you might want to close your eyes. I want you to imagine that you're a child aged around 5 or 6, and you're standing on a beach with your toes sinking into the cold, cool, soft sand. I want you to imagine that you're bending down and you scoop a handful of sand, and you feel the grain slipping through your fingers. Now, pick up your bucket and spade and start building a sand castle. You scoop the sand into your bucket, and then you turn it over and you give it a little tap, 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 and you slide the bucket off. Oh no, it didn't work. It didn't work. All the sand's all crumbled. But why not? Why didn't it work? Maybe we can try again. Maybe we take a different approach this time. We change something. So fill the buckets with sand again and turn it over. Fingers crossed. And we take the bucket off, and yes, this time it worked. What did you do differently this second time? Now you're no longer at the beach, we're moving now, and you're in a garden. Remember that you're still 5 or 6 years old. You can smell the freshly cut grass and the flowers. And I want you to look closely, and you'll spot a shiny little snail sliding across a leaf. Watch it closely. What does it look like? What is it doing? Do you want to touch it? And what happens if you do touch it? Now we're moving again and we're going indoors, and you've just discovered a piano. The keys feel cool and smooth to the touch, and as you press a key, you notice how heavy it is. Listen to that soft melodic sound that fills the room. Is it a high note or a low note? Experiment with the keys, playing random notes, and create your own unique little tune and melody and make up your own little rhythm. How does this make you feel? Okay, you can come back to the present now and your day job as a teacher, and slowly open your eyes if you have them closed. But I want you to think about that child in that imaginary situation, in those three situations, and think about what that child learned. So what do you think that child that you imagined learned when they were building a sandcastle at the beach? Feel free to type your answers in the chat box. Any ideas about what you think the child learned by building and experimenting with a sandcastle and the sand on the beach? Okay, Neva says they learned that the first time is not always perfect. Yeah, that's a really valuable lesson to learn, I think. Okay, we've got some skills in the chat. Focus, concentrate, practice makes perfect, senses of touch. They learned that maybe adding water can help with the sandcastle. Persistence, happiness. Oh, that's sweet. Yeah, okay, but lots of skills, yeah? Okay, what about with the garden, when you were in the garden watching the snail? And maybe you touched the snail or maybe you didn't. What do you think the child learned here? Observing, looking closely. Yes, curiosity, inquisitive, learning by doing. Yeah. Maybe they're learning something about nature as well, yeah, about the snail itself and how it protects itself. Confidence, okay, yeah. Okay, and finally, the piano, experimenting with the piano. What do you think they learnt while they were tinkering with the piano? It's okay to try, says Judith. Delighted and loving the sound. Okay, yep. Okay, lots of nice skills coming up here. And also, I love this word, joy, that one of you, that you've just written in the chat, Child, sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. The joy of just being able to experiment and try things out, yeah? Okay, brilliant. So all of those examples that we just visualized are real world learning. And if you did any of those activities as a child, you will have learned from them different skills, maybe some of the things that you've just shared in the chat. I want you to think about early years education for a moment. So early years could be preschool. Generally, it's ages 3 to 5 years old. And I want you to see if you can identify some actions, some verbs that I've given you the first letter for here. So verbs that children do in their early years education or their preschool classes. Okay, so the first one begins with a P and it's got 4 letters. What do you think this verb is? Okay, we're getting lots of plays in the chat. Okay, I'm just going to read out a couple of examples each time. Okay, the next one begins with an A and it has 3 letters. Okay, so I'm only going to read out the ones that begin with the letter. Okay, so we've got act. Okay, lots of acts, but we've also got art. And we've got ask as well. So 3 options there. We'll see in a minute. The next one begins with E. It's got, can't count them, 7 letters, I think. What do you think this verb could be? Okay, we've got explore, we've got excited, maybe excite. Explore. Okay, the next one begins with a D, and I think it has 8 letters. We've got draw, drawing, discover, describe, develop. We've got lots of options here. Okay, the next one begins with an E again, but it's slightly longer. So any more verbs beginning with E that you can think of? Elaborate, says Judith. Experiment. Exploring. Enlight, maybe enlighten. Experience. Okay. We've got a word with an I. Remember, these are verbs. So a verb beginning with I with 7 letters. Inquire, inspire, imagine. Okay. Some different ideas here. And the last one is another one with an A with 5 letters. So what could this be? Answer, attitude, action. Okay. Okay, I'm going to give you the answers now. So yes, you were right. It was play, ask, as in asking questions, explore, discover, experiment, interact, and adapt. So this is how young children learn. They learn about the world through play. They explore and they experiment and discover by interacting with materials, with objects, with toys, and with people. And they ask lots of questions. We know this, right? They also try things out and they adapt as needed. However, although this happens a lot in preschool and early years, it's suddenly taken away in primary school when they're expected to sit at a desk all day, and then there's a pressure to learn to read and write. So in this session today, we're going to think about these questions. What is real-world learning? What is inquiry-based learning? How does it work in primary ELT? And how can we maintain a linguistic focus? Because after all, we are English teachers. So, real-world learning. It's not just for preschoolers. At least that's what I believe. So if we have a look at this definition of real-world learning, I'll give you a second to read that. We can see from this quote that it can be used at any stage of life. Now, as I just said, we are English teachers, so our job is to teach language. But actually, there's nothing more real than language. It's language that's spoken by people all over the world in their real lives, right? So I think it's impossible to separate language from the real world. And it doesn't really make much sense if we do separate it. I do think that language isn't just another subject that you can learn, like maybe history or another kind of subject, because it's something that allows us to live and communicate in this world. And students are learning English to be able to function in different parts of this real world. So when we separate it and we break it down into vocabulary and grammar and different skills, especially if these are unrelated, it can create a kind of disconnect. But don't worry, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be teaching vocabulary and grammar. Of course, we do need to teach that. It's just that I think we need to think carefully about what language we're teaching, what vocabulary and structures we're teaching, and it needs to have a clear purpose. So I think we need to think about these questions. Why are we teaching it? What purpose it has? How it's useful and relevant to the students, and whether students need it or not. If we teach the vocabulary and grammar that students need to be able to communicate their ideas about something or to find out about something they're interested in, then it's going to be much more meaningful for them. I think we can try to harness our learners' curiosity about the world, and we can merge this with the language that we're teaching. And as I just said before, this can help provide really meaningful language learning experiences for our primary learners. So how can we do this? Well, we can do it with an approach called inquiry-based learning, which is what my session is really about today. So what is inquiry-based learning? You may have heard of it, it may be new to you, but don't worry because I'm going to explain and demonstrate. It's an approach where learners investigate a real-world topic in order to find answers to a question. So an inquiry is basically a project that's built around a question on a specific topic. It's often used in science, for example, in mainstream education, where students need to find something out through research and through experimentation. In English language teaching, it's usually a topic-based approach, but instead of us pre-deciding what students will learn and then just giving them the materials that we've chosen specifically, so instead of doing that, we're going to allow them to explore their own questions about the topic. So it goes back to that curiosity. We can center the inquiry around that curiosity, and we can use it to help the children learn language and not just language. It is an approach with a lot of learner autonomy. So those of you who went to Jorge's session just now, he shared lots of ideas about learner autonomy. But it's also very structured, and it always follows the same series of stages, which we are going to look at. So let's have a little look at the process, but this is going to be a really, really quick summary, and I'll go into more detail later. We start an inquiry with a question, with a driving question or an essential question, we call it. And this is a question that the students will hopefully have answered by the end of the inquiry project. So we start with this question, and then we use the students' own questions and their interests to develop a plan for what we will do in order to find answers. We then do some research in order to find answers and keep a record of any interesting or useful information. Then students analyze this information and they create a product such as a presentation where they showcase their learning to the class. And then finally, we reflect on what students have learned and on the whole inquiry process. So that's like a 30-second summary, a really quick one of the process, but don't worry because we're going to look at it in more detail in a minute. But first of all, I wanted to share some of the benefits. So first of all, it's relevant. We can use this approach to ensure that the language we're teaching is relevant to the students and it's based on their needs. So we're kind of creating a need for language by focusing on the things that our students are interested in and what they want to know and learn. The language they're learning is real and it's authentic, and they have a real purpose for using it. So that purpose could be to find out something, or it could be to share it with others. It's based on their needs. Emergent language plays a big part in inquiry-based learning as the learners explore their own questions. So it's always based on their needs in terms of language and content. And we can see where the gaps are in their knowledge, and we can focus on the language that they need to be able to carry out their inquiry. You can also tailor it to the learner's interests. You can choose topics that interest them, and you can invite them to come up with their own questions about what interests them and what they want to learn. You can adapt the level of the inquiry that different learners or different groups of learners do. So it's a kind of a more flexible way of differentiating, because you're not giving students different activities, you're just allowing them to explore different questions or different areas. And so it's quite a nice way of allowing for difference. It fosters learner autonomy, and they get to direct their own learning. There are different levels of autonomy depending on the level of inquiry that you do. But in general, it does foster independence. And this, as I mentioned before, Jorge Chacon's talk was really interesting, and he shared some ideas for getting students to become more autonomous with their own learning. And he also mentioned real projects. And so inquiry-based learning provides a kind of a context and a structure for doing this. And it's engaging and it's inclusive. In inquiry-based learning, the learners are fully involved. They help shape the inquiry with their own questions, and they're motivated to find answers to their questions. So this leads to increased levels of engagement. And because it's quite flexible, so I said before, with differentiation, you can have different groups of learners working on slightly different areas or different questions. And also students have a lot of choice about what they do. So this makes it more inclusive. And one more thing is that the focus is removed from the language itself. So that means that any learners who have struggled in the past with English, that maybe not very confident about English, it means that they can still feel capable and empowered to carry out the project, even if their language skills are still developing. So I'm sure you're wondering now, how does it work? I'm going to take you through an example inquiry process so that you get a clearer picture of what it might look like in the primary classroom. So first of all, I wonder if you can guess what the topic of this inquiry is from this image. What do you think this student inquiry is going to be about? Oh, cooperation. That's an interesting idea. I was thinking a bit more, something a bit more specific. So the actual, think about young learner topics and things they're interested in, because these are all skills that you're sharing here, which are really, really nice. And they're going to learn these things. They're going to learn teamwork and collaboration and all of these things. But the actual topic that they're going to learn about is, it's not quite ants, it's a little bit more general. It is mini beasts in general. So having a topic that is mini beasts allows us to, I think I've skipped a slide here. Let me just go back a second. No, oops, my mistake. The topic is mini beasts, and that would allow for different groups to focus on a different mini beast of their choice. So going back to the process then, we start with the wonder stage. And this is the very early stage of inquiry where we aim to spark curiosity and engage students in the topic. So we can bring in some objects. It could be any kind of object or toy or pictures or videos or books, anything to just get the students interested in the topic and excited about it. So with our topic of mini beasts, this could be some photographs of mini beasts. It could be some toy mini beasts like the ones you can see here. or maybe some Play-Doh to experiment with and play with, and they could make their own mini beasts. Quite a nice, easy thing to make out of Play-Doh. So this would just be to bring these items in, let students play with them, experiment with them without any kind of guidance. Then we want to introduce the essential question. So the essential question is the overarching question that we will keep coming back to throughout the inquiry and that students will have answered by the end. So we introduce this question to the class and invite some initial responses. So for this topic, our essential question is, how do mini beasts survive? So you'll see this is quite a broad question, and it could be answered in different ways depending on what we want students to investigate. There can be multiple ways of exploring this question. So for example, we might want to look at habitats. We could look at the food cycle. We could, if at a higher level, maybe we could focus on the human effects on biodiversity of a specific area. The areas you choose to focus on will depend on your students' age, their developmental level, and their linguistic level. So because it's such a broad question, I give my students sub-questions, which are a bit more specific. And these questions help me identify target vocabulary and structures that I think students will need during the inquiry. So let's have a look at my possible sub-questions for this mini beast inquiry. We have, how many types of mini beasts can you find? Where do they live? What do they look like? What can they do? How do they behave? How do they adapt? How long do they live? What dangers are there in their lives? What do they need to survive? And how can we protect them? So you can see that these questions go from simple, very specific questions at the top to more open, complex ones at the bottom. So I can choose questions for my students to research, maybe according to their linguistic level or their cognitive level. Or I could have my students choose the questions that they want to explore. In the next stage, the students then come up with their own questions. So with this one, what I might do is I might have each group choose a different mini beast to focus on. And I give them time to think about what they already know and what questions they have about this mini beast. So one way of doing this, and this is something I like to do, is the famous KWL chart. So here, students will write or draw, if they're pre-writers, what they know in the first column. And then they'll add their questions to the second column, the middle column. And doing this will help with the next stage, which is where we plan what to do next. So we plan how we're going to find answers to these questions. So we're at the planning stage, and you could do this together as a class. Maybe at first you could discuss, or what can we do to find information? Where can we look? Or you may want to plan activities yourself as a teacher the first few times you try this approach. And then later on, when students are more used to it, then they can become more involved in this process. After that comes the research stage, which is where the students go off and find information to help them answer their questions. However, we can't just tell students to go off and research the question. We're talking about primary learners, and yes, we want them to become independent and autonomous, but they need scaffolding and support to be able to do this. So you could do the research together as a class, or you could give students some guidance, or you could plan some activities that will help students find answers. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are different levels of inquiry with different levels of autonomy. So when students are used to this approach, then yes, maybe they can go and do their research themselves, and you just provide maybe some different resources. But when you're starting with this type of approach, I think you need to guide it and structure it a lot more. So we're going to look at some ideas for activities that students could do to help them find out how mini beasts survive. So the first one is a scavenger hunt activity where the learners make a list of mini beasts that they might find in a particular area. So it could be in the school yard or in their garden or in the street outside their house, or in a park. And then they visit that area and they just see what they can spot. They make a tally of the number of each mini beast they spot. So that's quite a simple activity. Another one, which they could maybe do afterwards, is a mini beast observation. So you could bring in a real mini beast. You'd have to check with your school about, and maybe your country's laws about what you can bring into the classroom. Or it could be a realistic toy model, and have learners observe it, examine it, maybe measure it. They could draw a diagram of it and label it. So they'll be focusing there on the physical attributes of the mini beast. You could do a traditional research activity, online search, as a whole class or in groups. You may want to search for some specific information about individual mini beasts, or focus on an area such as habitats or predators, for example. You can also show students some clips of different mini beasts from nature documentaries. There are loads of these that you can find online, so you could pick out some short clips, just have students notice what, what the mini beast looks like, what they do, how they live, their lifestyle, how they move, and all of these kind of things. There'll probably be some predators in there too. You might want to focus on life cycles of each mini beast. And then the last activity here is a bit different because it's kind of focusing on art, but I really like this activity because if you look at children's books, picture books, the images, the illustrations are usually not very realistic. So it's a really useful activity to have them compare these types of illustrations with a realistic image or a photo of the mini beast and notice the differences. So these are just some ideas of activities that could help students get some answers. You don't need to do all of these activities. You could just choose some of them, a couple of them, or even let the students choose. With the research, you're going to need some resources. And there are different types of resources that you can curate and bring in depending on the activities that you choose. There are lots of non-fiction books available on a range of topics. There are also lots of educational websites with information, particularly about animals and things like that. We mentioned videos and also maybe magazines, particularly if they're magazines aimed at children. But something we haven't yet mentioned is people as resources. So you could invite experts into your classroom. Maybe they could join on a video call, or you could invite a local expert. And even if they don't speak English, it doesn't matter. They can do it in their L1, in their home language, and then you could get the children to write up or work on the information in English. So they'd be using their translanguaging skills here. You could also do research, jigsaw research activities. So if each group is researching a different mini beast, they could then share what they've learned with others, and they could use that in their final products. And also with some topics, surveys can be a nice research activity to do. So they could do a survey with other people in the class or in their school or with their neighbours and so on. So now they've done their research, they will have some answers, or at least some information that will help them answer the essential question. And more importantly, they'll have some evidence that backs up their answers to the question. So it's important to keep a record and document their learning throughout the inquiry. And this is the evidence, everything that they collect, all of the material and the information. So different ways of documenting this information. It could be done by the teacher. So you could create a display if you have space in your classroom. You could create a wonder wall with the students' questions, and then that's where you post the information as well. You could get students to put their work up so you can see the process of the inquiry on the wall. There are some great examples online. If you search for PYP, class display, which is the International Baccalaureate Primary Years Programme, you can find some great examples, really inspirational. Or you could have students keep their information in a folder or maybe a digital portfolio. Again, the information doesn't have to be text. It could be videos, it could be audio clips, it could be drawings, or a mixture of everything. So if they have a place to keep it, I think that's really helpful. So now it's the create stage, and this is where students create a product that they will share with the class. So a product is a vehicle for showcasing what they have learned, and they can choose to do this in different ways. So the product's a way of bringing everything together, and actually knowing that they have to produce a product gives them a purpose for sorting the information beforehand and deciding what to include to show their answers to the essential question. So the product is collaborative, so it's done in groups. Ideally, it's chosen by the students. It's a culmination of everything they've learned in the inquiry, and it's also a showcase piece to say, this is everything that I've learned. It should answer the essential question. It should show their learnings, and it should hopefully demonstrate the correct usage of the target language, which we're going to focus on in a minute, the language itself. I've just seen that there's a question in the chat. Karen, could you put that question in the Q&A so that I can come back to it later, because I think it might be difficult to find again here. So I said that students can choose what to do, what to create as their products. It could be, for example, a documentary, a short video that they make. Maybe they record some footage of mini beasts to include, or maybe they just use pictures. They could also do a mini book. They could make a presentation, maybe including some statistics. They could make a poster. It could be paper or digital. They could create a lap book. I don't know if you know what lap books are, but they're really nice. Kind of, they're like made out of card, but they have like flaps and pockets and envelopes and things. Search for it online if you're not sure what it is. It's a really nice way of presenting information too. Or maybe they make a play or a story, a performance of showing what they've learned. It doesn't have to be something so factual. I mean, it's based on fact, but it could also be a more creative representation. So finally, sharing what you've learned is really important. So they present their learnings to the class. And then there's also the reflection stage. Now, reflection is a really important part of the inquiry process because it helps students think about what they've discovered, what they still need to know, and what they will do next. So this icon of the little girl thinking, this is reflection. And I give my students reflection activities at different stages. And then also at the end, where they also reflect on the language that they've learned. So talking about language, I'm aware that time is passing very quickly, so I'm going to try and do this as quickly as possible, so you have time for questions at the end. So what I do is I try to predict the language that my students will need. And I create these inquiry resource packs, but they're aimed at a range of different teaching contexts and levels. So I include a variety of possible language objectives. So here, for this inquiry, here are some of the vocabulary areas that I think that students might need, depending on the activities that we do. And here are some of the structures that I think they might need too. They might need them at different stages of the inquiry. For example, understanding the resources in the research stage, or to express their prior knowledge about the topic. There's also functional language that they'll need. So they'll need to make suggestions, express preferences, make decisions, take turns, all of these things, because they're working in groups. And also there'll be some more incidental language that the students will come across during the inquiry, which we can deal with when it comes up. So going back to these sub-questions, you can think about the vocabulary and structures that we might need. So for the first question, it would just be vocabulary for mini beasts. With where do they live, they need places in nature and habitats. With what do they look like, they'll need colors and adjectives and body parts. With what can they do, they'll need action verbs and so on. So you can see how, depending on the language that you want them to learn, you can choose sub-questions or write sub-questions that will require this language. You'll notice that the questions are mostly in the present simple, but you could introduce other structures or functional language if your students are beyond that level. So maybe connectors or sequencers, or even conditionals, probably. You know, you just have to think about it a little bit more. So sometimes I get asked this question, can I combine inquiry-based learning with a communicative approach? And of course you can, because it is a very communicative approach to start with. It's based on communication and collaboration. And one thing I want to point out is that inquiry-based learning is more of a wider method rather than a procedure. So it provides a general framework for structuring a series of lessons. It doesn't prescribe exactly what happens in each lesson. So this means that you can still use your favorite ways of presenting and practicing language. You can still use your favorite techniques and strategies. For example, in the early stages of the inquiry, you may want to work with specific language that you want students to learn. So you can still use your games and your songs and your other activities to provide more practice. And you can also try to ensure that students get spaced repetition of the language throughout the different stages of the inquiry. So the aim of using an approach like this is to provide meaningful reasons for learning and practicing the language. So if we go back to the beginning of this session, we started thinking about real-world learning and how using real-world examples and problems to guide students towards understanding the world can be an effective way of fostering a positive and engaging classroom environment. So inquiry-based learning allows us to do this, but whilst also teaching language that is meaningful and relevant to the students and their interests. It just provides the framework, and what students do within that framework should be tailored to their interests if possible. So choose topics and subtopics that your students are interested in or they care about, and things that are relevant to their lives. So I'm going to finish in a minute, but I have one more question for you. And this is actually a question from the pre-task from my video. What real world topics could you explore with your students? Think about those topics I said that your students are interested in, what they would like to find out about, and also think about maybe your syllabus if you have one and how it might connect. So share your ideas in the chat, and then in a minute we'll move on to questions. So Nancy says climate change. Yeah, that's a really good one. Araceli, technology. Okay, yeah, so there's lots of, I mean, technology is a huge topic, so they could maybe choose a focus. Global warming, traditions around the world, yet another nice one for global citizenship. Countries around the world, social media, healthy habits, yeah, another nice one, and very useful as well and relevant. Professions and occupations, yeah, kids are always interested in professions and jobs, aren't they? So yeah, that could be a really nice one too. Sports and hobbies, culture. Okay, music. I mean, there's so many, aren't there? There are so many. So the thing is, you need to get to know your students and just try to find out what they are interested in and see how you can develop an inquiry with them on those topics. So in this webinar, I've only really covered the surface, and there's a lot more to learn about inquiry-based learning. If you do want to find out more, you might want to take a look at my website, or you can send me an email, which is on the screen here. You can also find me on social media. And I also have a YouTube channel where I talk about this, inquiry-based learning and other learner-centered approaches. I've also provided a handout that contains a handy guide to the process, the inquiry process, using the model that we've looked at today. So if you want to have a look at that, maybe see how you could use it in your classroom. So that's it from me. I haven't gone over too much. So I'm going to have a look at the Q&A and see what questions we've got. Okay, so Afsana is the method in linear relation to Reggio. Okay, I don't know a huge amount about the Reggio Emilia approach, but yes, I went to a really good workshop on it last year, and there's a lot of things in common with it. I think also it's that idea of constructivism and the learners building their knowledge. And I think a lot of that is in line with the Reggio Emilia approach.
I'll just take this moment to say thank you, Michelle. Yes, everyone is saying thanks in the comments. I'll help you with the Q&A as well, because I saved the ones that went kind of past too fast, which is good, because those were some good questions. But yeah, let's take a look at what else is there. Kothwar says, can you give us some resources? And it's a good opportunity to say again, go and watch Michelle on YouTube, go to her website, find more resources, find more ideas. She's got a lot. Let's go, Michelle, to the question that came up in the chat that I think you were interested in. It was from Karen Jameson, and Karen asks, typically, how long would you allow for a piece of inquiry? Like, across how many lessons might you plan for something to last? It can be a difficult question, but
yeah, it's the short answer is it depends. It's flexible, so you know, it depends on your context. So unless you've got obviously a very high stakes testing environment where you're really limited, you could be flexible about how long the inquiry lasts. So it can last from anything from a couple of lessons to a whole term. You could, I mean, one thing is you could spend your whole lesson on the inquiry, or all of your lessons, or you could just spend 10 minutes a day on the inquiry. If you have to use a course book and you're struggling to integrate the two, because you can also use a course book with this approach, but if you're struggling to integrate, then you could have it as maybe an extra thing if necessary. But yeah, with my resource packs, what I do is I suggest a 6-lesson kind of so I provide like a plan for 6 lessons, and that's what you'll see on the handout, I think. But
that follows
it
each
also,
of the stages.
yeah, with the stages, but that's kind of basing it on a very structured approach where you'll be maybe doing 2 or 3 different activities in the research stage. But imagine your students are really interested in it, then you could quite easily extend it to make it into a longer project, a bigger project. I also have some ideas for follow-up tasks as well. So when students are really interested in it, I like to make it a bit more project-based and have them actually do something at the end of the inquiry as well, or take it further.
Yeah,
And
you
the
mentioned
opposite could be true. So like if your students are not interested in it and they're finding it boring, then, just make it shorter, or try to find a way of kind of redirecting it so that they are engaged in it. So yeah, no, there isn't really a correct answer to this question, I'm afraid.
that's a great answer, and it means you're listening to the children and working with them as well, which is kind of at the heart of this approach, isn't it? I'll comment on something that you mentioned at the end, and maybe you were touching on there. You talked about a showcase kind of piece, something to show to parents. Is that something you could show to parents? Someone asked in the chat. Is this something that could kind of make it into a project that they have a wall display or a video or something like that? Is that what you mean by showcase piece?
Yeah, well, what they produce as the product, it would be their showcase piece. It's just a way of kind of ending on something that they've got something to show for what they've learned, and it shows what they've learned. And I think it's a really nice idea to get the parents involved or the rest of the school. So if you can create some kind of display, or maybe even it could be some kind of a presentation to the public. Yeah, you could maybe set something up, invite parents in, or put something online, for the parents, not publicly, where they're presenting it. I think it's really nice, and especially if it's related to something local in the community. I think that's a really nice way of having that connection with the community. So you could have an inquiry based on a real problem or something real that's happening in your community, and you could set up something where you invite people, and I think that is what would that makes it so meaningful for the students. They can really see how that the English that they're using. I mean, maybe they'd need to do it also in their L1, because if your members of your community might not speak English, maybe they could do it in both. But it just shows the importance of what they're doing, and there's a reason for learning this stuff. It's not just because my teacher says, or because it's in the course book. I've got real public here who want to hear my opinions and what I know, and so I think it's really a really nice way of continuing the inquiry.
Yeah, I can see that, and it just adds another layer of real to everything. Like I would love to be back in a classroom again, in your class, Michelle, learning about mini beasts and watching videos and researching. And I can imagine all the younger people in my family would love to go and see a presentation about that, or learn about that from the young people in a class. So yeah, that sounds great. There's a couple of questions that relate to the same topic, and I think there may be teachers that teach kind of slightly older learners, like older primary or younger teens, high school students. Elisabeth and Lila say, kind of, could this work with older students in high school?
Definitely. I mean, I don't really work with, I don't work when I don't write for secondary anymore. I mean, I have taught secondary and adults and all ages, but yeah, and in fact, somebody recently asked me if they could use it in a one-to-one class with an adult, and I said, well, why not? That's the perfect example of, you know, the class should be based on the learner's needs if it's a one-to-one situation. So yeah, go with what they're interested in and what they need to know about. And with secondary, it can be really hard to engage secondary students. So finding that topic that does interest them and motivate them is, you know, is invaluable, really. And yes, it can be hard to get them, especially in secondary, to at first it can be hard to get them to try and be work independently, and I think Jorge talked a bit about this as well. He said it was easier with the younger ones, and it quite often is, but it's about I think the way you focus it, and you need to give them responsibility, and then they will, you know, they'll end up taking a bit more responsibility, they'll get into it, and especially if it's something that relates to them. I think that's the most important thing. So
I really think
find the right topic, basically, and ask them.
True. It brings me back to this morning's presentation. Nenad talked about virtual city creation, and he did that with older teens. And so, yeah, we've seen another a nice example of that today. So if you didn't see that, go back and watch the recording, everyone. It's time to finish now, that. Michelle. Okay. Yeah, you should. So everyone, we're finished today. We've talked about role plays with Chris this morning, spelling journals with Elena, virtual cities with Nenad, learning through speaking with Shona, learner autonomy with Jorge, and we're finishing here with Michelle. We hope to see everyone again tomorrow. Just a reminder that you need to register for tomorrow's event. You need to register for Friday morning, Friday afternoon, and Saturday, so that you can enjoy all of those webinars. So do that on our webpage. You can find that in all the communication we've sent to you. And one final thanks to Michelle. I had a really great time, and I wish I was a learner in your class. So good night, everyone. Thanks to Joe Gore, Kath McClellan, Paul Braddock, Marcus, Karen, and everyone working behind the scenes as well. Take care, everyone. Until tomorrow. Happy World Teachers Day. Good night.
Bye, everyone.